Evening. Welcome to the Institute of Politics ARCO Forum. Tonight's event, focusing on German reunification and its impact on the superpowers in Europe, is co-sponsored by the American Council on Germany. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the American Council on Germany and to also thank the panel members, the forum staff, Shep Stone, Jim Cooney, Dodie Riggs, and all those who assisted in preparing this event. As a former participant in American Council on Germany conferences, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Mr. Carol Brown, the current president of the American Council on Germany.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I think the size of this audience says something about the interest in the subject that we're here to discuss, and I find it absolutely remarkable that to ponder the fact that had we been here a year ago, we probably would not have been discussing this subject at all, even 6 months ago, and we certainly not to a standing room only crowd. I think it's a sign of the times we're living in. Before introducing our panel and our subject matter this evening, I'd just like to take just 2 minutes to tell some of you who've never heard of the American Council on Germany what the organization is. The American Council on Germany was organized some 35 years ago by some of the key people responsible for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II and reconciliation between Americans and Germans. John J. McCloy, who was our first High Commissioner in Germany, Mrs. McCloy, General Lucius Clay, the man who ran the Berlin airlift, Mr. Erich Warburg, prominent American and German family, all were instrumental in setting up this organization, designed, as I say, to help create a dialogue again between Germans and Americans. And that's what we've been doing ever since. We do this through a variety of programs involving exchanges between young professionals. We have young leader meetings once a year. We have very high-level, senior-level meetings every other year. We have a modest publications program. We sponsor speakers, and we also seek ways to maintain that dialogue between the United States and Germany. Until a few months ago, we always said the Federal Republic. I mean, obviously, we have to expand our geographic horizons in light of some of the things we'll be talking about tonight. But I am particularly pleased to be here at Boston because another goal of our organization is to spread out beyond the mainly New York focus of our council over the past and to make sure that we are in touch with those vital economic and intellectual centers outside of New York City. We have on our panel tonight all of the three American members of our board of directors, and I'll introduce each panel member later. We also have in the audience the former president of the American Council on Germany and current vice chairman of our board, Dr. Richard Hunt, who is also Marshal of Harvard University. We have a distinguished group of people to discuss this subject tonight, subject being a reunited Germany, impact on Europe and the superpowers. As I said earlier, it's hard to believe that we could have been here this evening talking about this subject a year ago. Had we done so, we probably would have reversed the order and would have talked about the superpowers first and then maybe reunification as an afterthought. I think that Russell Baker would probably be the first to admit that he's no de Tocqueville, or for that matter, a Walter Lippmann. But in his column this morning in the New York Times, he started out saying, "We can now mothball the word superpower. The Soviet Union, which used to be one, is unraveling. And the United States, which still talks like one, is becoming irrelevant." This may be something of an exaggeration, but it is true, as I hinted earlier, that the focus of so much happening in Central Europe today is on Germany and not on the superpowers. We're delighted to have from Bonn this evening one of the ranking experts in the Western world on the Soviet Union, Ambassador Andreas Marlandro, who has served his country 4 times in Moscow, and on his last 2 tours of duty was the West German ambassador in Moscow. He is currently Chief of Staff to President Richard von Weizsäcker, and is continuing without question to deal with East-West matters in Soviet Union, particularly in his present job. We have also Dr. Guido Goldman, who comes, he was reared in Manhattan, educated here at Harvard, Bachelor of Arts and PhD. He's currently the director of the Center for European Studies, where he's been in charge since 1969. He's also a director of the German Marshall Fund, a co-chairman here in the United States. Professor Joseph Nye, educated at Princeton, Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and here at Harvard. He's been a professor here at Harvard since 1969, and he's been director of the Center for Science and International Affairs since 1985. He earlier served as a special assistant, a deputy to the Undersecretary of State, where he received one of the highest decorations given by the State Department in that job. I've asked each of the panelists to talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and I will call time if this limit is exceeded. And then we'll go seriatim with the panel, and then of course we'll have time for questions and answers after the panelists have made their presentations. So we start with Ambassador Andreas Marlandro.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you again, and thank you for the chance to take part in this panel and to have a possibility to present a German view on the developments which have taken part in my country and in Central Europe. Developments which, as you rightly say, none of us could have foreseen to happen in the pace, the depth, and the implications in international affairs which it has produced, or which they have produced in the last 2 or 3 months. Germany was divided after the Second World War. Germans were living in 2 states with antagonistic social systems, divided also by the worldwide antagonism between the free world and communism, the dividing line of NATO and Warsaw Pact going through their country, with the strange exclave of West Berlin in the center of the GDR, 60 million people living in the West, 16 million approximately in the East. Nevertheless, about a third of our countrymen in the West has relatives in the East. It is one people, and also the division of 40 years has not changed this basis. During the last decades, a number of efforts have been made to alleviate the situation, some successful. We have had quite a bit of contact between families, especially in the west-east direction after the 70s, and official contacts, especially in the framework of the CSCE process. But still, last year, the President and Secretary of GDR and Secretary General of the Communist Party of East Germany, Honecker, said that unification of the two Germanys was as much excluded as the harmonization of fire and water. And now the borders are open. We have an enormous move in both parts of Germany for unification. People want it, and it will happen. It is very difficult, though, because we have international implications. We have a lot of mistrust resulting, and I think it is justified, from our history in our neighboring countries, that a strong Germany would be a danger for them again. So everything which we do to foster unification must be in harmony with our partners and with our neighbors. Big issue is how we could arrange that with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, which fought a war which was imposed by Germany on them, had enormous losses, and had gained this war, had come to Central Europe with a glacis, with still 380,000 troops in East Germany, and which will have big difficulties to make away with this presence, and I think they will stick to it, at least in a modified form, as long as they can. We have also the necessity in our security situation, even if the Soviet Union has become weaker, and there is certainly not an active danger going out from the Soviet Union, to keep our relationship, security relationship, intact over the Atlantic with the United States. We need the United States also from a moral point of view to develop a democratic society in Eastern Germany, in the whole of Germany. This is enormously important. We need your support. We have a great number of bilateral problems to resolve. The economy is in a bad shape in East Germany. People leave. Now it is by a number of 2,000 a day who come over to our country, and that are not the worst, but the best people from there, who look for a chance to enhance the standard of living. They make a simple calculation. They say if in their profession a colleague in West Germany has that and that standard of living, and until he would have it in East Germany, it would take maybe 15 years. If he went over to the Federal Republic, he might gain the same standard with some luck in 15 months. So you can imagine what the decision is. So our main task is now to go in economically, to try to build up the country as far as possible, at least to give these people hope to stay at home, because otherwise it would be also a burden on our society which we couldn't bear and where we couldn't offer them a decent life. I think I have made my presentation as far as...
Thank you. Dr. Goldman?
I thought we were going to do Joe next. I think we're going to do Joe next.
Excuse me.
Let me say that the question of how many Germanys are consistent with stability in world politics has been the dominant question of international politics since 1870. And those of you who have forgotten, Bismarck's answer to the question was 2. Hitler's answer was 1, and it was a disaster. And since 1945, the answer has been 2, and widely believed to be 2, until this last few months when everybody says it's inevitable that the answer will be 1. But 1 need not be a disaster. It need not have the same effects as in the past if one thinks of the differences in which a democratic Germany, with a firm anchor to the West, has an ability to play a role in Europe which is very different from a Germany which is in the center of Europe, casting about for different alliances to East and West and feeling insecure in itself. So the critical question that we ought to face in terms of the relations with the superpowers and the impact on stability is not whether there will be one Germany. I suspect most people would believe there will be of some sort, but how and when. Now, it's hard to predict how and when, and the reason is that there are two different kinds of forces that are at work at the same time, and let me, to simplify, call them forces that come from the bottom up and forces that come from the top down. The forces that come from the bottom up are the forces of nationalism and social discontent that we see so strongly in East Germany today, as Dr. Marlandro has pointed out. The failure of the East German government has been clear for some time. The forces that come from the top down essentially are the forces that come from the Soviet Union, which has had a very strong interest in making sure that there remained two Germanys. Now, I think everybody, or almost everybody, who would have talked about this issue a year ago and was asked to predict when the Germanys might come together again would have got the answer wrong. There may be a few brave men and women who will say they got the answer right. I'd like to see it written before I believe them. So one of the questions we should ask is, why were we all so wrong, myself included? And I think the question is that we misestimated what was happening from the top down. The failure of the East German government has been known for a long time. It was clear in 1953 when there was a revolt in East Germany. It was clear again in 1961 when the wall was built. But the general conventional wisdom is that the Soviets would never permit the reunification of Germany into one, because after all, that was what had been the settlement of World War II, what they'd fought about. But now we find that there's an interaction between these forces from the top down and the bottom up, which makes it extremely difficult for the Soviet Union to cope. When Hungary cut a hole in the wall, it was Germans that poured through it. And now there's no wall. And with 2,000 people a day crossing, and many more likely to cross after the elections, you have limits on Soviet options that are coming from these bottom-up forces. Now, the traditional Soviet policy toward a united Germany was one which is often called in the trade a declaratory policy. You say something, but you don't necessarily believe it. And the declaratory policy was that, yes, the Soviets would be quite willing to see German unification in exchange for neutralization of Germany. All troops removed, American troops go back home to North America, and so forth. But I think the Soviets were always ambivalent, always doubtful about whether that's what they really wanted. In fact, when Brezhnev gave a speech in the early 70s, basically rescuing the Americans from their own domestic congressional pressures to remove troops from Europe, you began to get the idea that maybe the Soviets weren't all that unhappy about the American presence in Europe after all, because it helped to justify their presence in Eastern Europe. And certainly one could have picked that up in a variety of private talks that I and others have had with Soviets over the years. In fact, a funny anecdote, by some accident I happened to have been in, all places, Tokyo on November 9th, the day the wall came down, and I was supposed to give a joint press conference with a high Soviet official. And what intrigued me was that he couldn't have heard the news any more or any longer than I had, and he immediately reversed official Soviet policy 180 degrees, because when he was asked, just hours after the announcement of the wall coming down, now will you support German unification in response for neutralization, his answer was absolutely not. He said it is much too soon, it would be terribly destabilizing, it's important to keep the security and structures in Europe as they are now. And the follow-up question, does that mean you want American troops to stay in Europe and NATO to stay? He said, yes, for now. A complete reversal done within an hour of the announcement of the wall coming down. Now, Soviet policy remains ambivalent. When Gorbachev and Modrov met, there was a bit of euphoria, which was reported that Gorbachev had agreed to the Soviets eventually accepting some sort of German unification. and there was just a question of timing. But notice that a day or two later, Shevardnadze quickly changed or backed away from Gorbachev's official position. And it's also interesting, if you note, that in the newspaper today, in the reports of the plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, that Ligachev, who's often regarded as the right-wing opposition to Gorbachev, the more conservative position, let me quote you what Ligachev is reported to have said from today's New York Times. "A Germany with huge economic and military potential is looming on the world horizon. I think it's time to recognize this new danger and loudly proclaim it to the party and the people," he added, implying that Mr. Gorbachev had failed to do so. Now, the interesting thing is, what did Shevardnadze say, who represents the liberal tendency in Soviet foreign policy thinking? Shevardnadze said, "The ghost of revanchism is roaming Europe hand in hand with the ideas of unity and unification. The new status of the German question has raised dangerous hopes for redrawing of borders." Not an awful lot of difference from the sound of that between the hard and the soft line in the Soviet Union. Indeed, one can remember Gorbachev's quote to Mitterrand, at least as reported by the French press, that the day that the two Germanys are reunited, there will be a new leader in the Politburo in Moscow. Now, the interesting question then is, with that framework of thinking, what are the Soviet options? How can they respond to what we have said earlier is probably likely to occur? Well, there seem to be four. The status quo, but that's untenable because of these bottom-up forces. They could also use force. After all, there are 380,000 Soviet troops in eastern Germany, but that would be enormously costly to them, both at home and abroad. It would certainly have enormous costs in terms of what they're trying to accomplish in their foreign policy and get the relief from external pressures for their perestroika at home. They could also, on a third option, they could go back to the old Stalin option of 52 and offer the Germans neutrality in turn for unification. In other words, instead of just talking about it, as they've done for the last 40 years, they could actually say, well, if we're going to lose our part, let the Americans lose their part, and that's at least better than being kicked out all by ourselves. But it's not at all clear that that's what they want, because notice that when Modrow mentioned that after his meeting with Gorbachev, he quickly backed away from it within a day or two later. It's not likely that he backed away from that entirely on his own. I suspect that faced with this question, the Soviets still think it may be better to have some Americans there than to have a neutral Germany which may not stay neutral forever. And the fourth option is the prospect of an institutionally bounded Germany, one in which you might say the strategy for dealing with German unification is Gulliverization, tying the Germans down with many small and possibly partly visible threads. Their membership in the European community, in the Conference on Security in Europe, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, the more you can keep Germany wrapped in these various threads, the less threatening it may seem. It's interesting to notice, if you looked at General Jaruzelski's comments last week about Poland's view, and the Poles do not in any way want to see the Warsaw Treaty Organization evaporate right away. As one Pole explained it to me last year, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, from Poland's point of view, is a treaty a la carte. If there's ever a problem of the Soviets wanting to move westward, the Poles won't join. But if there's ever a question of the Germans raising the issue of their eastern borders, they just as soon be in the Warsaw Treaty Organization. So there's still a little bit of institutional interest, at least in parts of Eastern Europe, in that dimension as well. So the interesting questions in this area will be what sorts of institutions can be agreed upon with the Germans and with the West, which may essentially answer the question of how and when. And that brings me to my final comment, which is the U.S. role. The general American position on German unification has been one of support. And the reason, I think, is the Americans are really not threatened by united Germany. Even Russell Baker can be wrong, Carol. The Americans do remain a superpower. I have a book that's about to appear that argues that the arguments for American decline are greatly exaggerated. Just a simple fact, the GNP of a united Germany will remain 1/5 the size of the United States. or another way of putting it is the American federal government will spend as much in 1 year as the entire GNP of the two Germanys put together. So the idea that a united Germany is some threat to the United States is simply not true. What is true, however, is that the Americans remain not irrelevant, but very relevant to the sense of stability with which Europeans react to a united Germany. And in that sense, a continued American presence is very important. And in that sense also, President Bush, I think, has played this relatively well, in which he has said that we favor German unification, but we want to see it done step by step with Germany's other countries in Europe, so that there are not instabilities, which after all is what drew the Americans into Europe twice already in this century. And what that means in concrete terms is the importance of strengthening the European community, though I suspect the net effect of German unification is going to be to dilute rather than strengthen it. Nonetheless, there are steps we can do to try to help to strengthen it, to continue support for the CSCE, and to think about a Germany which is unified, but indeed in terms which does not frighten its neighbors. And that strikes me as pretty well expressed in American policy thus far. But before we sound too sanguine and confident about it, let me remind you that the key question is what will happen with these forces from the bottom up. A collapse in Eastern Germany, a collapse that's so rapid and catastrophic that the West German political system can't cope with it, may exceed even the American as well as the Soviet power to respond. And in that sense, though not for the reasons he said, Russell Baker might turn out to be right. Thank you.
I was asked to speak about German unification and Europe, and what I'd like to do is give you a sense of several expectations that I have as to what's likely to happen, and then look at the two major issues, European integration 1992 being one, and European security arrangements being the other, and say something just in conclusion about that. Now, among the expectations that I have for the process of German unification is that it's going to happen much more rapidly than most people would like, including the West German government. Because of the developments that Joe just referred to, the bottom up, the extraordinary economic weakness of the GDR is going to compel that this issue has to be addressed on a very rapid timetable. Secondly, whether it's a contractual community or a confederative structure, there are different kinds of definitions of how the two German states should get together. It's going to absorb a very significant resource from the Federal Republic. One estimate that The Economist printed recently is that it would take about 800 billion Deutschmarks to bring the GDR up to the level of the Federal Republic. That may be an exaggeration, but the ecological disaster in the GDR is going to make any kind of economic investment there much more expensive than we had thought. Thirdly, I believe it's pretty clear today that this issue of how the two German states relate to each other and what happens in the GDR is going to be the issue in West German politics in a very political year. You have important state elections in mid-May, and you have important state elections in October, and then you have national elections in December. West German elections, to some degree, are being fought and will be won in the GDR. My next expectation is that the high saliency of this issue in Germany and the degree to which it becomes relevant to these elections is going to put particular stress on the Bonn government to try to harmonize what is being said for electoral purposes and what is being done and conveyed externally. This is a very difficult tension point for that government. It explains, for example, in my judgment, why Chancellor Kohl did not choose to inform the Allies about his 10-point program when he announced it in the Bundestag. He certainly was inclined to want to do that, to share this with the American ambassador and the State Department, but the danger of its leaking out would have to some degree preempted some of the political value of the way in which he chose to announce it. We'll see more of that. And I also believe that while most other nations may be ambivalent about German unification, and some might even be opposed to it, that no one is going to do anything to prevent it, even those who could do something to prevent it. And those who could do something are obviously the Soviet Union. I completely agree with Joe Nye that the use of Soviet forces to prevent unification would be extremely costly. step. And then, of course, you have the four-power status, so you have a significant role for the United States, France, and England, but I don't quite see how that can be used against a process that is seen as legitimate within Germany. I agree with Chancellor Kohl. This is really an issue on the whole that's going to be decided by the Germans. Now, let me look briefly just at what this may mean for 1992 for European integration. First of all, the GDR will become a member of the European community, whether as part of a unified Germany or whether in some other kind of status. Delors has already said that. And furthermore, it's really a logical extension of the present situation in which there is no tariff barrier between the two German states. Delors has pursued a very shrewd and very astute line here in trying to pursue a close harmonization of positions between Brussels and Bonn. That step, however, this inclusion of the GDR in the European community poses a very serious problem because it makes much more manifest the claim of others to get in as well. And you have two sets of claimants there. You have the EFTA countries and you have the other East European countries. And so you're going to have a very significant debate between the so-called wideners and the deepeners, those who say, let's bring everybody in, or those who say, you can't do that because you dilute the whole process too much. Let's first intensify membership and then begin to accommodate others. And that debate is going to rage quite substantially and will intensify because of this process of unification and bringing the GDR into the community. Now, for European Economic and Monetary Union, which is at the center of what we talk about when we talk about 1992, there are some negatives, there are also some pluses. On the negative side, you have the increasing priority for the West Germans of first addressing the issue of the Ostmark and a common currency with the GDR. And that's quite complicated, very difficult to do, and will slow, in my judgment, or should slow, the degree to which the Bundesbank, which is reluctant anyway to have a common currency in the West, is willing to sort of move in that institutional direction. So that's a negative. Second problem that I think is going to emerge quickly is that there are limited resources even for a country as rich and as successful as the Federal Republic. And if even a portion of this 800 billion is spent on the GDR and the attendant claims then from Poland, Czechoslovakia, elsewhere, restitution claims also, and then the catalog of payments in the European community, that may simply be more than the voter or the system is willing to pay. So that may slow down the process. And you may in fact find that in this electoral year you're going to get resentment on the part of some, perhaps just fringe movements in the Federal Republic, the Republicans in particular, against all of this foreignness. Why do we have to pay so much for all these things that aren't German? That tendency will be offset by two very powerful forces, which we should not underestimate. One is the absolute desire, determination of the government in Bonn to anchor this process of unification and expansion in European integration. The government is absolutely committed to that, and I think understands well that if you slow down the process of integration, then unification becomes more threatening to everybody. So I think you have a real commitment of the government, and secondly, you have a tremendously high stake of the real players on the commercial side, the businesses, the banks, and so on, who in no sense think that East Europe looms as interesting as West European integration. So it's hard to make a prediction, but to some degree you can see it's a more encumbered process. And on the security side in Europe, I think it is difficult to envisage that the Soviets will be willing to remove their entire forces from the GDR. I just can't see they're doing that. But, you know, it was difficult to envisage anything that happened this past year, so one can be very wrong in making those kinds of statements. The Soviet Union has ceased to behave as a great power without losing a war, and that's unprecedented in the history of international relations. But I think at a minimum there'll be some kind of Guantanamo solution where, you know, we still have forces in Cuba, they can have forces in East Germany, or something along those lines. There will have to be some face-saving security arrangement made to accommodate the Soviets at a minimum. Secondly, on the security side, further steps towards unity will require the demilitarization of the GDR, its territory, and the absolute sanctity and recognition of the Polish western border. And as far as I can see, the Federal Republic has gone now completely to the position of accepting that border. There are still some legal aspects, but these are really fine points. I could be wrong, but it's my impression that the question of the border will not arise. The third, the issue of denuclearization of Germany, which was floated frequently by the Soviets, is likely to be raised again. I don't think it's going to be pushed very substantially, because I think it is something that the Federal Republic will not buy, the neutralization, but the denuclearization, taking nuclear weapons out of the territory of the Federal Republic, is an issue I think we'll hear a lot about. And that might end up being very popular in Germany, because in Germany the concern that German territory becomes the battleground, linked to a Soviet proposal that nuclear weapons be taken out, you could see winning a lot of popular support. The anticipation that forces will be reduced further below the proposals made by Bush is not unlikely. Some form of European response to all this is also likely, that there'll be some intensification of efforts to create some kind of European defense community that is somewhat more substantially powerful than what we have today, to replace some of the thinning out, and in my judgment that would create some kind of role then also for the British and French forces, who are after all nuclear. In conclusion, do I think that I want to ask the question, will this produce stability, this kind of development, or are we heading towards something which is going to be unstable? I think '89 was the great year. The difficult problems now are going to be putting this all together in a way that stability will emerge. If Germany can carry the load of unification and integration and helping the East European economies all at the same time, then I'm relatively optimistic. I'm not so worried about the enlargement of the size of the German economy, as Joe and I just indicated, as compared to the United States. It's not that overwhelmingly large. You have to take into account that the gross national product of the GDR is about 1/10 the size of that of the Federal Republic. So by putting the two together is the same as sort of having 3 or 4 good growth years in the Federal Republic on its own. Putting the populations together, you go from 60 million to 78 million or 77 million. It's an accretion of population in the largest country, but still, it's not an overwhelming change from where we are today. Europe has learned to live with a very powerful Germany. Germany has learned to live with that power as well. So I'm relatively optimistic on that side, and I believe that security can be safeguarded. The two risks that I see that are very substantial are, one, that all of this produces a system overload, that too much happens too fast, and that voters cannot absorb that pace of change, do not wish to pay the price in increased taxes or whatever, or some discomfort to absorb all this, and that we therefore become a little bit the victims of, or the entire process becomes hostage to what the West German electorate can sustain, given all of these elections. And my second big worry is that in Southeast Europe, and perhaps elsewhere in East Europe, ethnic strife and economic difficulties may together produce so much instability that the sense of well-being in the West may be adversely affected.
Thank you, Guido. I think it's a tribute to the vast experience our three speakers have had in sitting on panels such as this that none of them went beyond the allotted time this evening, and that gives us more time for questions and answers. But I would like to start with something that both Joe and Guido touched on and Ambassador Marlandro did not touch on, and perhaps you could comment on it. That has to do with the border question. I'm not sure that the people in Warsaw will agree with Guido's comment that the border question will not arise, because as we all know, everything that the Chancellor has said so far on the border issue has really not placated the Poles, both communists and non-communists running that country. And there is a certain ambivalence and still some questions out there with regard to the official German position on the border question, and I think some differences perhaps maybe even within the coalition, certainly as between political parties on this subject. But I wonder if you just take a minute or two to comment on that subject.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it is absolutely true what has been said before, that we have to get this question resolved in a way which satisfies the Poles. We cannot expect a change of the border on Oder and Neiße between East Germany and Poland in any way if we want to have reunification. And Minister Genscher, our foreign minister, put it into the phrase that he said, everybody who opens up the question of the eastern border closes the door on German reunification. I think this is also the position of all the members of the government and of the coalition in general. The problem which has maybe played a role is that we certainly have an international law situation that this border is, when it was established, put under the condition of being recognized or decided upon finally by a peace treaty. And that is what has been said by the West German government, and by some stressed a bit more and by others stressed a bit less. And the Poles say, okay, even if it's so, this is a rather new position, if it is so, we want the West German government to say that we, the West German government, when coming to unification, will not change it, although it might have to be decided by an international peace treaty, which we didn't get after 1945 because in the conditions of the Cold War, this was not feasible. I'm rather sure that some declaration of that kind with an international bearing will come about at the latest during the CSCE conference, which is planned for November this year. And also a statement which has been made by the Chancellor about several weeks ago in Paris has been already taken up by the Poles quite positively. They say this is the right way, and we just want that this be made official German policy. And I think this will be the case because, as I said before, this, our neighbors, our partners, and also the Soviet Union, East Europeans, will not accept if we will be fiddling around this question.
Okay. Again, before opening up for questions, would any of the other panelists care to comment on what others have said before we take questions? Please.
May I make one remark to the Soviet attitudes? It was interesting, naturally, how these differences were developing during the last days and 2 weeks. First, after the visit of the Prime Minister from East Germany, Mr. Modrow, in Moscow, where we all thought that the statements which have been made by the Soviets were rather positive in as far as unification is concerned. And now this fierce attack of Ligachev, by the way, the first attack on Gorbachev's foreign policy, which he made, because he naturally hoped to have some support for this position in the party and in the population, and the statement of Shevardnadze. I want just to say that as far as I know, and I think I do know, when Shevardnadze speaks of revanchism, it is just the question of the Oder-Neiße line and the stretching Germany beyond this Oder-Neiße line again, which he calls revanchism. He has no problem with unification. And this, I think, I didn't listen to the news today, but I was told that Secretary Baker, after his meeting with Shevardnadze, had said that Shevardnadze had made a statement that that the Soviet Union would be ready to consider some sort of NATO membership of a united Germany, which would go very far.
Okay, we're now ready to take questions and comments. I will recognize questioners on the basis of hands held up. I'll ask anyone who is recognized to go to one of the two microphones, address your question, if appropriate, to one of the panelists, and I'll ask you to be as brief and succinct as possible. Back there.
Professor Goldman, I was interested in a statement that you made about the potential political realignment in the United Germany. I noticed the news carried a story today that a poll published yesterday in East Germany indicated that I think 54% of the population would vote for the new Social Democratic Party in East Germany. I wonder what the implications would be in terms of the voting patterns in United Germany, since that would seem to indicate a permanent majority for a united Social Democratic Party. Possible repercussions in terms of foreign policy.
This is, of course, very speculative because you haven't had a free election in that part of Germany since before 1933, and now you have these polls. The likely trend is that the SPD will emerge as the largest party in the East for a number of reasons, and then I'll address the overall picture. One is Saxony and Thuringia were always SPD strongholds, as was Berlin, East Berlin in this case. Strong Protestant population composition. And the fact that the SPD was forced to sort of into a undesired unification with the Communist Party, into this so-called Socialist Unity Party. And therefore, the SPD is not tainted by having remained as an independent party in coalition with this government, which the CDU Ost is. For those of you who may follow these things, the GDR had a regime which had a communist party, which called the Schatz, but which also brought into play four small parties, one of which is known as the CDU Ost. And that has posed some problems for the CDU in the West because there was an ambivalence about whether or not one should cooperate with a party that seems to have been complicit in so much of the old. Now, that has changed in recent days. Three parties, two of them new, and the CDU Ost have been brought together and will create an electoral group for the March 18th elections. But nonetheless, it is likely that the SPD, which was refounded in October, changed its name very recently, and now is conforming very much with the same kind of overall identity as the SPD West, but there are significant differences between the two. It'll probably do very well. The forecast when I was in Germany last week was 35-40% of the vote. What does it mean long term if you have an SPD-led government in the East and a CDU-led government for the time being in the West? I think two things. One is that whoever wins the East German elections to some degree will affect the outcome of the West German elections. But I don't know in what direction. It's not clear. But it is clear that these two states will affect each other. And the second thing is, I think although Parteipolitik is very strong in the Federal Republic, sometimes too strong, I still imagine that the kinds of issues that have to be resolved are so critical, so urgent, that whichever party is in office on either side, barring the SED, is going to be able to more or less come to terms with the other on the issues. The long-term forecast I would make for West German political outcomes is that you're going to have a lot more discussion over creating a grand coalition where the CDU and the SPD, or the CDU, SPD, and the FDP all combine after the December elections in order to tackle these very serious problems.
comment there. Is the question addressed to any particular panelist, or would you like? Anyone like to respond?
Well, all right. I mean, as far as the political stance concerning the view to voters of the right wing is concerned, I think this is a little bit easy and one-sided. One thing is clear, that in the CDU we have a very strong wing of refugees, well organized, who have an important say in the party's decisions. And so if there is this attitude, or has been this attitude, to try not to give a definite answer to the border question, but just put it at the decision of a peace treaty, then it was, I think, in the first line, something which was due to the inner party discussion in the CDU. But I think that this has been overcome. Also, as Guido Goldman has said, I think this will play no role anymore very soon, because it is indeed a crucial question in relations with unification.
The British are in a bit of a bind because, on the one hand, keeping West Germany tied into a strong European community solves a problem which is a problem for them, which is a traditional worry about German strength. On the other hand, Mrs. Thatcher's view of the European community is one which wants to keep it from becoming too supranational, from becoming too strong in the sense of a central hierarchy. So the British basically this current British government is faced with a bit of a dilemma, which is too strong a Europe would go against the free market preferences of Mrs. Thatcher, the anti-bureaucratic preferences, and too weak a Europe would essentially fail to contain German energies. And I don't think that the British have come to terms with that dilemma yet.
Let me just make add one more wrinkle to all that. We don't know. Anyone who wants to make a forecast who's going to win the elections in December is not well positioned to do so. But if it turned out that La Fontaine was able to put together a coalition with, say, the Free Democrats and some of the Greens, and if you did have an SPD victory in the elections in the GDR, that also would affect to some degree some concerns that Mrs. Thatcher would have about what German policy would look like. Not forecasting that, but it's a further factor.
Desire and see that as a way of securing their western borders, so to speak, and at the same time keeping Germany, a reunited Germany, in check.
I think these are Soviet experts. I think I'd rather I really think Marlandro should
Okay, well, I mean, this is rather hypothetical, I think, because Russia and the Soviet Union, as it is organized now, will not fit into the EEC. The EEC membership is a decision which has to be taken now by 12 countries, and I do not see any chance of the Soviet Union to be accepted as a member of the EEC.
The first part of my question is directed to Dr. Goldman. The seminar began with the virtual fait accompli by Mr. Marlandro that German unification. Sure. The seminar began with Mr. Marlandro describing a fait accompli that German unification would take place. Directed towards Dr. Goldman. Does the pace with which German unification is taking place worry you in that Germans seem to be working at the pace that might preclude many of these agreements and requirements having the time to be put in place before German unification? It's moving so rapidly that American policy and Western policy seem so vague at this point. Do you see any kind of danger of German unification taking place with some of these things unable to be put together? And the second part of my question, directed towards Dr. Marlandro, is that at some point I believe it's ironic to hear a discussion going on well over an hour without the emotional ties that World War II have to Germany. The words Auschwitz, the words Rotterdam. At some point in the discussion, these things are going to come up into a much larger voice, and how is the West Germany plan to deal when those emotions arise to the surface?
Well, I think that there's no one who would take issue with the fact that if this process could be slowed down, that would be desirable. Most of all, I think the West Germans. But that simply isn't the case. Maybe with the wisdom of hindsight, it would look to have been foolish that the West German Constitution gave every East German the right to arrive across the border and claim citizenship and all the rights of citizenship. But nonetheless, that was extended. In fact, the West German system is very forthcoming in terms of granting asylum, not just to Germans, but to others. Under those circumstances, you now have a situation where you have a crisis. The elections were moved